A grammar school is one of several different types of school in the history of education in the United Kingdom and other English-speaking countries. Originally a school teaching Latin, but more recently an academically oriented secondary school. The original purpose of medieval grammar schools was the teaching of Latin. Over time the curriculum was broadened, first to include ancient Greek, and later English and other European languages, natural sciences, mathematics, history, geography, and other subjects. In the late Victorian era, grammar schools were reorganised to provide secondary education throughout England and Wales. Scotland had developed a different system. Grammar schools of these types were also established in British territories overseas, where they have evolved in different ways. Grammar schools became the selective tier of the tripartite system of state-funded secondary education operating in England and Wales from the mid-1940s to the late 1960s and continuing in Northern Ireland, with the move to non-selective comprehensive schools in the 1960s and 1970s. Some grammar schools became fully independent and charged fees, while most others were abolished or became comprehensive. In both cases, many of these schools kept grammar school in their names. More recently, a number of state grammar schools still retaining their selective intake gained academy status, meaning that they are independent of the local education authority. Some parts of England retain forms of the tripartite system, and a few grammar schools survive in otherwise comprehensive areas. Some of the remaining grammar schools can trace their histories to before the 16th century. Early grammar schools. Although the term scholae grammaticalis was not widely used until the 14th century, the earliest such schools appeared from the 6th century, e.g., the King's School, Canterbury and the King's School, Rochester. The schools were attached to cathedrals and monasteries, teaching Latin, the language of the Church, to future priests and monks. Other subjects required for religious work were occasionally added, including music and verse, astronomy and mathematics and law. With the foundation of the ancient universities from the late 12th century, grammar schools became the entry point to a liberal arts education, with Latin seen as the foundation of the trivium. Pupils were usually educated in grammar schools up to the age of 14, after which they would look to universities and the church for further study. The first schools independent of the church, Winchester College, Oswestry School and Eton College, were closely tied to their universities. They were boarding schools, so could educate pupils from anywhere in the nation. An example of an early grammar school founded by a medieval borough corporation unconnected with church or university is Bridgnorth Grammar School, founded in 1503 by Bridgnorth Borough Corporation. During the English Reformation in the 16th century, most cathedral schools were closed and replaced by new foundations funded from the dissolution of the monasteries. For example, the oldest extant schools in Wales, Christ College, Brecon and the Friars School, Bangor, were established on the sites of former Dominican monasteries. King Edward VI made an important contribution to grammar schools, founding a series of schools during his reign. In King James I founded a series of royal schools in Ulster, beginning with the Royal School, Armagh. In theory, these schools were open to all and offered free tuition to those who could not pay fees. However, few poor children attended school, because the labour was economically valuable to their families. In the Scottish Reformation, schools such as the Choir School of Glasgow Cathedral and the Grammar School of the Church of Edinburgh passed from church control to borough councils, and the burghs also founded new schools. With the increased emphasis on studying the scriptures after the Reformation, many schools added Greek and, in a few cases, Hebrew. The teaching of these languages was handled hampered by a shortage of non-Latin type and of teachers fluent in the languages. During the 16th and 17th centuries, the setting up of grammar schools became a common act of charity by nobles, wealthy merchants and guilds. For example, Spalding Grammar School, founded by John Gamlin and John Blanche in 1588, and Blundell's School, founded in 1604 by wealthy Tiverton merchant Peter Blundell. Many of these are still commemorated in annual Founders' Day services and ceremonies at surviving schools. The usual pattern was to create an endowment to pay the wages of a master to instruct local boys in Latin and sometimes Greek without charge. The school day typically ran from 6 a.m. to 5 p.m., with a 2-hour break for lunch. In winter, school started at 7 a.m. and ended at 4 p.m. Most of the day was spent in the rote learning of Latin. To encourage fluency, some schoolmasters recommended punishing any pupil who spoke in English. The younger boys learned the parts of speech and Latin words in the first year, learned to construct Latin sentences in the second year, and began translating English-Latin and Latin-English passages in the third year. By the end of their studies at age 14, they would be quite familiar with the great Latin authors, and with Latin drama and rhetoric. Other skills, such as arithmetic and handwriting, were taught in odd moments by traveling specialist teachers such as scriveners. In 1755, Samuel Johnson's dictionary defined a grammar school as a school in which the learned languages are grammatically taught. However, by this time demand for these languages had fallen greatly. A new commercial class required modern languages and commercial subjects. Most grammar schools founded in the 18th century also taught arithmetic and English. In Scotland, the borough councils updated the curricula of their schools so that Scotland no longer has grammar schools in any of the senses discussed here, though some, such as Aberdeen Grammar School, retain the name. In England, urban middle-class pressure for a commercial curriculum was often supported by the school's trustees, but resisted by the schoolmaster. Supported by the terms of the original endowment, very few schools were able to obtain special acts of Parliament to change their statutes. Examples are the Macclesfield Grammar School Act 1774 and the Bolton Grammar School Act 1788. Such a dispute between the trustees and master of Leeds Grammar School led to a celebrated case in the Court of Chancery. After 10 years, Lord Eldon, then Lord Chancellor, ruled in 1805, "There is no authority for thus changing the nature of the charity, and filling a school intended for the purpose of teaching Greek and Latin with scholars learning the German and French languages, mathematics, and anything except Greek and Latin." Quote, although he offered a compromise by which some subjects might be added to a classical core, the ruling set a restrictive precedent for grammar schools across England. They seem to be in terminal decline. Victorian-era grammar schools. The 19th century saw a series of reforms to grammar schools, culminating in the Endowed Schools Act 1869. Grammar schools were reinvented as academically oriented secondary schools following literary or scientific curricula, while often retaining classical subjects. The Grammar Schools Act 1840 made it lawful to apply the income of grammar schools to purposes other than the teaching of classical languages. A change still required the consent of the schoolmaster. At the same time, the national schools were reorganizing themselves along the lines of Thomas Arnold's reforms at Rugby School, and the spread of the railways led to new boarding schools teaching a broader curriculum, such as Marlborough College. The first girls' schools targeted at university entrance were North London Collegiate School and Cheltenham Ladies' College, modelled on the Clarendon Commission, which led to the Public Schools Act 1868, which restructured the trusts of 9 leading schools. The Taunton Commission was appointed to examine the remaining 780 42 endowed grammar schools. The Commission reported that the distribution of schools did not match the current population, and that provision varied greatly in quality, with provision for girls being particularly limited. The Commission proposed the creation of a national system of secondary education by restructuring the endowments of these schools for modern purposes. The result was the Endowed Schools Act 1869, which created the Endowed Schools Commission with extensive powers over endowments of individual schools. It was said that the Commission could turn a boys' school in Northumberland into a girls' school in Cornwall. Across England and Wales, schools endowed to offer free classical instruction to boys were remodelled as fee-paying schools teaching broad curricula to boys or girls. In the Victorian era, there was a great emphasis on the importance of self-improvement, and parents keen for their children to receive a decent education organised the creation of new schools with modern curricula, though often retaining a classical core. These newer schools tended to emulate the great public schools, copying their curriculum, ethos and ambitions, and often took the title grammar school for historical reasons. A girls' grammar school established in a town with an older boys' grammar school would often be named a high school. Under the Education Act 1907, all grant-aided secondary schools were required to provide at least 25% of their places as free scholarships for students from public elementary schools. Grammar schools thus emerged as one part of the highly varied education system of England and Wales before 1944. In the tripartite system, the 1944 Education Act created the first nationwide system of state-funded secondary education in England and Wales, echoed by the Education Act 1947. One of the three types of school forming the tripartite system was called the grammar school, which sought to spread the academic ethos of the existing grammar schools. Grammar schools were intended to teach an academic curriculum to the most intellectually able 25% of the school population as selected by the 11+ examination. Two types of grammar schools existed under the system. There were more than 1,200 maintained grammar schools, which were fully state-funded. Though some were quite old, most were either newly created or built since the Victorian period, seeking to replicate the studious, aspirational atmosphere found in the older grammar schools. There were also 179 direct grant grammar schools, which took between 1/4 and 1/2 of their pupils from the state system, and the rest from fee-paying parents. They also exercised far greater freedom from local authorities, and were members of the Headmasters' Conference. These schools included some very old schools encouraged to participate in the tripartite system. The most famous example of a direct grant grammar was Manchester Grammar School, whose headmaster, Lord James of Rusholme, was one of the most outspoken advocates of the tripartite system. Grammar school pupils were given the best opportunities of any school children in the state system. Initially, they studied for the school certificate and higher school certificate, replaced in 1951 by General Certificate of Education examinations at O-level and A-level. In contrast, very few students at secondary modern schools took public examinations until the introduction of the less academic Certificate of Secondary Education in the 1960s, until the implementation of the Robbins Report in the 1960s. Children from public and grammar schools effectively monopolized access to universities. These schools were also the only ones that offered an extra term of school to prepare pupils for the competitive entrance exams for Oxford and Cambridge. The tripartite system was largely abolished in England and Wales between 1965, with the issue of Circular 1065, and the Education Act 1976. Most maintained grammar schools were amalgamated with a number of other local schools. to form neighbourhood comprehensive schools, though a few were closed. This process proceeded quickly in Wales, with the closure of such schools as Cowbridge Grammar School. In England, implementation was less even, with some counties and individual schools successfully resisting conversion or closure. The Direct Grant Grammar Schools Regulations 1975 required direct grant schools to decide whether to convert into comprehensives under local authority control or become independent schools funded entirely by fees. Of the direct grant schools remaining at that time, 51 became comprehensive, 119 opted for independence, and 5 were not accepted for the maintained system and expected to become independent schools or to close. Some of these schools retained the name grammar in their title but are no longer free of charge for all but a few pupils. These schools normally select their pupils by an entrance examination and sometimes by interview. By the end of the 1980s, all of the grammar schools in Wales and most of those in England had closed or converted. Selection also disappeared from state-funded schools in Scotland in the same period. While many former grammar schools ceased to be selective, many of these also retained the name grammar. Most of these schools remain comprehensive, though a few became partially selective or fully selective in the 1990s. Contemporary British grammar schools. Today, grammar school commonly refers to one of the 164 remaining fully selective state-funded schools in England and the 69 remaining in Northern Ireland. The National Grammar Schools Association campaigns in favour of such schools, while Comprehensive Future and the Campaign for State Education campaign against them. England. At the 1995 Labour Party conference, David Blunkett, then education spokesman, promised that there would be no selection under a Labour government. However, the party's manifesto for the 1997 election promised that any changes in the admissions policies of grammar schools will be decided by local parents. Quote, under the Labour government's School Standards and Framework Act 1998, grammar schools were for the first time to be designated by statutory instrument. The Act also defined a procedure by which local communities could petition for a ballot for an enter selection at schools. Petitions were launched in several areas, but only one received the signatures of 20% of eligible parents, the level needed to trigger a ballot. Thus, the only ballot held to date was for Ripon Grammar School in 2000, when parents rejected change by a ratio of 2-1. These arrangements were condemned by the Select Committee for Education and Skills as being ineffective and a waste of time and resources. There are still 164 state-run grammar schools in existence. Only a few areas keep a formal grammar school system along the lines of the tripartite system. In these areas, the 11+ exam is used solely to identify a subset of children considered suitable for grammar education. When a grammar school has too many qualified applicants, other criteria are used to allocate places, such as siblings, distance of faith. Such systems still exist in Buckinghamshire, Rugby and Stratford districts of Warwickshire, the Salisbury district of Wiltshire and most of Lincolnshire, Kent, Reading and Medway. Of metropolitan areas, Trafford and most of Wirral are selective. In other areas, grammar schools survive mainly as very highly selective schools in an otherwise comprehensive county. For example, in several of the outer boroughs of London, these schools are often heavily oversubscribed, and award places in rank order of performance in their entry tests. In some lees, as many as 10 to 15% of 11-year-olds may attend grammar schools, but in others it is as few as 2%. These very highly selective schools also tend to dominate the top positions in performance tables. No further radical changes proposed by either of the main political parties. Although many on the left argue that the existence of selective schools undermines the comprehensive structure, the Labour government has delegated decisions on grammar schools to local processes, which have not yet resulted in any changes. Moreover, government education policy appears to accept the existence of some kind of hierarchy in secondary education, with specialist schools, advanced schools, beacon schools and similar initiatives proposed as ways of raising standards. Many grammar schools have featured in these programs, and a lower level of selection is permitted at specialist schools, though many in the Conservative Party favour the expansion of grammar schools. Since 2006, the party's policy has been that no new grammar schools will be built, except to cope with population expansion in wholly selective areas such as Buckinghamshire and Kent. David Willits, former Shadow Education Secretary, argued that because middle-class parents now invest so much in preparing their children for the tests, grammar schools no longer offer opportunities to gifted children from poorer backgrounds. The development of academy schools in England has reinvigorated the debate on selection, since it is sometimes argued that some academies are using covert pupil selection. Northern Ireland attempts to move to a comprehensive system have been delayed by shifts in the administration of Northern Ireland. As a result, Northern Ireland still maintains the grammar school system, with many pupils being entered for academic selection exams similar to the 11+. Since the open enrollment reform of 1989, these schools have been required to accept pupils up to their capacity, which has also increased. By 2006, the 69 grammar schools took 42% of transferring children, and only 7 of them took all of their intake from the top 30% of the cohort. The 11+ has long been controversial, and Northern Ireland's political parties have taken opposing positions. Unionists tend to lean towards preserving the grammar schools as they are, with academic selection at the age of 11, whereas nationalist politicians lean towards scrapping the 11+. Despite vehement protestations from the majority of Catholic grammar schools, most notably by the Board of Governors at Rathmore Grammar School in Finaghy, and Lumen Christian Derry, the Democratic Unionist Party claimed to have ensured the continuation of the grammar school system in the province as part of the St Andrews Agreement in October 2006. By contrast, Sinn Féin claims to have secured the abolition of the 11+ and a veto over any system which might follow it. The last government-run 11+ exam was held in 2008, but the Northern Ireland Assembly has not been able to agree on a replacement system for secondary transfer. The grammar schools have organised groupings to run their own tests. The Post-Primary Transfer Consortium and the Association for Quality Education. The Northern Ireland Commission for Catholic Education has accepted continued selection at Catholic grammar schools as a temporary measure, but wishes them to end the practice by 2012. As of October 2014, the practice continues.